She was 20 years old and had not slept beneath a roof she could call her own in 11 days when she walked the last mile into the town of Millbrook Hollow, with blistered feet and a coin purse holding no more than could be counted in a single closed fist. It was her stepfather, Garrett Voss, who had put her out of the only home she had known, declaring the family farm too small and too poor to feed a grown stepdaughter, who was, in his words, no blood of his and no longer his burden to carry. What she had left, after selling her mother's wedding ring just to eat, was $15, and with 12 of those dollars, at a tax auction nobody else in the valley wanted to attend, she bought the rotting, silent ruin of an old river mill on Cutter's Creek, its great wooden water wheel jammed and rusted still for the better part of a decade. Everyone who watched her sign that deed agreed it was the purchase of a foolish, desperate girl throwing away her last coins on a heap of drowned timber. But behind that water wheel, sealed inside a chamber no living soul in Millbrook Hollow remembered existed, waited a secret that had been silent for 18 years. One that would not only save this one young woman from ruin, but would restore an entire valley's faith in itself. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Marion Teale. If a story like this speaks to something in you, we'd be glad if you followed along with us here on the channel, so you never miss the next one. And if you're watching from a town that people forgot too, tell us about it in the comments below. Marion Teale had been born not in Millbrook Hollow itself, but 2 counties east, in a modest river town along the Kanawha, where her father, Silas Teale, had worked as a millwright for the better part of 20 years, coaxing grain mills and sawmills alike back to life with nothing more than patience, a keen ear for the particular groan of tired machinery, and hands that seemed to understand wood and iron the way other men understood Scripture. It was from her father, and not from any schoolhouse, that Marion learned the quiet trade that would come to define her, following him from job to job through her girlhood, holding his lantern while he worked late into the evening, listening as he explained the turning of a millstone, the patient math of gears, the way a water wheel's paddles had to be set just so to catch the current without fighting it. Silas Teale was not a man given to lengthy speeches, but the ones he did give stayed with his daughter for the whole of her life, and none more than the one he gave her the summer she turned 12, kneeling beside a broken mill wheel that every other man in the county had declared beyond saving. "Folks look at a thing gone still," he told her, running his thumb along a warped paddle, "and they think stillness means dead. But water doesn't care how long a wheel's been quiet. Give it a channel, and it'll turn again." Marion's mother, Constance, had died, bringing her only daughter into the world, and so it was Silas alone who raised her, and it was Silas alone whose memory she carried when, in her 15th year, a fever swept through the river towns of that valley and took him from her in the space of 9 days, leaving Marion an orphan with no property, no income, and only the tools of a trade that few believed a girl could rightfully practice. It was in the aftermath of her father's death that a distant cousin of her mother's, a widow named Eunice Voss, took Marion in out of what she called Christian duty. And it was through this arrangement that Marion came to live under the roof, and later under the authority, of Eunice's second husband, Garrett Voss, a hard, calculating man who ran a modest feed and grain store in the town of Ridgeline, and who made it plain from the start that he considered Marion's presence in his household a debt she would, someday, be expected to repay. For 5 years Marion kept that household running with a competence Eunice herself seemed grateful for, cooking, mending, keeping the store's ledgers straighter than Garrett ever managed himself. And in the evenings, when her chores were finished, she kept her father's old millwright tools oiled and sharp in a battered leather roll beneath her bed, practicing what little she could on broken hinges and stuck gate latches around the property. refusing to let the one true inheritance her father had left her, not land, not money, but knowledge, go to rust the way the world around her seemed determined to let it. Eunice Voss passed from a wasting illness in the spring of Marion's 20th year, and it was this loss, more than any other single moment, that set loose everything Marion had feared quietly for years. Because it was Eunice, not Garrett, who had ever offered the girl any real warmth, and Eunice, not Garrett, who had been the thin thread by which Marion belonged to that household at all. The fall, when it came, arrived with the particular cruelty of a decision dressed up as simple practicality. Within a month of burying his second wife, Garrett Voss called Marion into the small back office of the feed store, where he kept his ledgers, and informed her, without much preamble, that the household could no longer support a grown woman who was, after all, no blood relation of his own, and that it was high time she made her own way in the world, as any capable young woman ought to. He offered her, as though it were generosity itself, a single week to gather her things and find lodging elsewhere, and when Marion, stunned, reminded him of the 5 years she had spent keeping his household and his books in order without a wage to show for it, he answered only that room and board had been payment enough, and that she ought to be grateful he had tolerated a stranger's child under his roof for as long as he had. Marion left Ridgeline on foot with her father's leather tool roll, a single change of clothing, and what little money she had managed to set aside from selling small mended items to neighbors over the years, a sum that dwindled fast once she was forced to pay for meals and a bed in whatever boarding house would take a woman traveling alone. She sold, with a grief that still tightened her throat to remember, the plain gold band that had been her mother's, the one keepsake Silas had kept of his young wife, and passed to Marion before he died, because 11 days into her wandering, she found herself with nothing left but coin enough to survive another week, and a growing understanding that no town along that river seemed to have honest work for a woman who arrived alone and unconnected, however capable her hands might be. It was in a rundown boarding house in the town of Millbrook Hollow, nestled in a narrow green valley where Cutter's Creek ran down out of the hills toward the wider river beyond, that Marion first heard mention, from the tired innkeeper pouring her a cup of weak coffee, of the old grain mill standing empty at the edge of town, silent since a flood some 18 years before had damaged its wheel and driven its last owner, a reclusive man named Absalom Kestrel, to abandon the property entirely and vanish from the valley without explanation. The county, the innkeeper said, had held the deed for years on unpaid taxes and was finally auctioning the ruin off that very week, mostly, he suspected, just to be rid of the liability, since not a soul in the valley believed the old mill worth saving. Marion walked to the county office the following morning with 12 of her remaining $15 folded in her palm, and stood at the back of a thin, uninterested crowd. And when the auctioneer called the lot, mill, wheel, and the half-acre of creek bank ground it stood on, she raised her hand before her own fear could talk her out of it, and heard her bid of $12 land in a silence so complete that even the auctioneer paused before bringing down his gavel, as though waiting for someone, anyone, to offer more and spare her the foolishness everyone in that room seemed to assume she was committing. She walked out to the mill that same afternoon, following the creek upstream past pastures gone to seed and fences long since fallen, until the old structure came into view at a bend in the water, a broad, low building of gray, weathered timber, its roofline sagging at one corner, its great wooden waterwheel standing motionless and choked with vines where the creek still ran cold and steady. Beneath it, it should have looked, to any reasonable eye, like exactly what the townsfolk believed it to be, a ruin not worth the coin she had paid. But Marion stood at the edge of that quiet water with her father's voice returning to her, plain and clear as it had been the summer she turned 12, and felt something in her chest steady itself for the first time since Eunice's funeral. She spent that first night in the mill's dry upper loft, wrapped in her one blanket, listening to the creek murmur below the floorboards, and woke at first light determined to see, with her own trained eye, exactly what condition the wheel and gearing were truly in. It took her the better part of a week, working alone with tools she cleaned and sharpened each evening by lantern light, to clear the vines and rot from around the wheel's axle, and it was on the seventh day, while she was tracing the wheel's iron shaft back into the mill's lower chamber to examine the gearing that turned the millstones above, that she noticed something the previous owner's design should never have allowed: a second, narrower shaft running parallel to the main axle, disappearing into the thick stone foundation wall at an angle that served no purpose she could identify in the ordinary mechanics of a grist mill. Millwrights, her father had taught her, built nothing without purpose. Every shaft, every gear, every beam served the turning of stone against grain, and a shaft that led nowhere useful was not an oversight, but a decision, deliberately hidden. She followed that narrow shaft with her lantern held low, tracing it to where it vanished behind a section of foundation stone that, on closer inspection, sat just slightly uneven against its neighbors, its mortar joints thinner and fresher than the weathered stone surrounding it. Her hands, trembling now not from cold but from a rising certainty, found a section of that stone loose enough to work free with her father's small iron pry bar, and when at last it gave way, revealing a narrow chamber built into the mill's own foundation and connected, she now understood. By that second shaft to some hidden mechanism above, Marion Teale found herself looking by lantern light into a space that Absalom Kestrel had built with his own hands and had meant, it was plain, for no one else to ever find. Inside that hidden chamber, dry and undisturbed for nearly 2 decades, Marion found a small iron strongbox, a stack of yellowed ledgers bound in cracking leather, and a single framed photograph of a young woman she did not recognize, her features solemn and careful in the way of old photographs, her dress marking her as a woman of some means rather than a miller's wife. It took Marion 2 full days of careful reading, by lantern light each evening after her work on the wheel was done, to understand the story those ledgers told. And when she finally did, she sat back against the cold stone wall of that hidden chamber and felt the whole shape of the valley's quiet history shift beneath her. The way a millstone shifts on its bed when a hidden flaw is finally found. Absalom Kestrel, the ledgers revealed, had not simply been the valley's miller, but had also served in the years before the flood as an informal banker for half of Millbrook Hollow, a common enough arrangement in a country still thin on real banks, where a trusted, established man might hold deposits for his neighbors and pay modest interest from the profits of his own trade. The ledgers recorded, in careful, obsessive detail, deposits from nearly every family in the valley: the Pruitts, the Ashfords, the Calloways, dozens of names Marion did not yet know, but would come to know well, sums both large and small, set aside for dowries, for land purchases, for the lean years every farming family feared. And then, in an entry dated only weeks before the flood that had ruined the wheel and driven Kestrel from the valley, the ledger's careful tone changed entirely, becoming the anguished, half-legible scrawl of a man in crisis, confessing to himself, if to no one else, that he had made unwise loans against the valley's savings to a shipping venture on the river that had failed entirely, and that he stood, on the very night the flood came, to lose not only his own fortune, but every dollar the valley had trusted him to keep safe. The final entry, written the morning after the flood waters receded, was brief and final. He had managed, in the chaos of the flood, to hide what remained of the actual deposited coin, some $4,300, the ledger noted precisely. Inside this chamber of his own design, intending, he wrote, to return for it, once he had found some way to make right the losses from his failed venture, without the valley ever learning how close its savings had come to vanishing entirely. He had never returned. Whether shame, or fear, or some misfortune on the road had kept him from it, the ledgers could not say. But Marion understood, sitting alone in that hidden chamber with the framed photograph of the unnamed young woman propped against her knee, that she was holding in her hands both the answer to a mystery that had quietly haunted this valley for 18 years, and a fortune that belonged, every dollar of it, to families who had long since given up hope of ever seeing it again. Word that the strange young woman at the old mill had found something inside the foundation moved through Millbrook Hollow with the particular speed of small-town rumor, growing more distorted with every telling. Until by the time Marion rode into town to speak with the county clerk about the ledgers, most of the valley had already convinced itself that she had found either buried outlaw gold or nothing at all, and opinion divided sharply between those eager to believe the more exciting story and those certain the whole thing was some elaborate trick by a penniless drifter looking to swindle honest folk. It was into this uncertain climate that a man named Reuben Ashford inserted himself, a prosperous landowner whose family had banked more with Kestrel than almost any other in the valley, and whose own father, Marion would later learn from the ledgers, had been among those who lost the most in the failed venture that triggered the whole disaster. Reuben, upon hearing rumor of the hidden fortune, arrived at the mill within days with an offer that he dressed in the language of neighborly concern. He would purchase the mill and all its contents from her outright, sparing her, he said, the burden and danger of holding on to valley money that rightfully belonged to established families, rather than a stranger with no roots in Millbrook Hollow at all. When Marion, wary of both his tone and his timing, declined to sell before she had properly verified the ledgers against county deposit records, Reuben's manner cooled considerably, and it was not long before whispers began moving through town, suggesting that the mill's sale to her had been improper to begin with, that a woman traveling alone with no kin in the valley had no business holding deed to property that might contain the community's lost savings, and that the matter ought to be taken from her hands entirely and settled by more established men. Reuben pressed this argument before the town council, arguing that Marion Teale was, by her own admission, a stranger passing through, and that whatever she had found beneath that mill belonged, by right of original deposit, to the town's leading families to sort out and distribute as they saw fit. A proposal that conveniently would have placed the disposition of $4,300 largely in the hands of men like Reuben himself. Marion, standing before that council in a plain traveling dress with her father's tool roll still slung over one shoulder from the morning's work, did not argue with anger, though she had every right to. She laid the ledgers open on the council table instead, page by careful page, and showed them Kestrel's own precise handwriting recording every family's deposit down to the dollar, and asked only that an impartial accounting be made against whatever records the county itself still held of the original bank failure, so that every dollar might go back to exactly the family it belonged to, including, she noted quietly, watching Reuben's face carefully as she said it, the significant sum the ledgers showed had been withdrawn from the general account only 3 days before the flood, under Reuben Ashford's own father's signature, a withdrawal that did not match any corresponding record of repayment or use in the ledger's careful accounting. The council chamber went very still at that. Reuben Ashford's composed insistence faltered for the first time since he had begun pressing his claim, and though he tried to recover his footing, suggesting the entry must be some error or misunderstanding from Kestrel's own troubled final months, the county clerk, a careful and unbiased man named Otis Fairweather, requested to examine that particular ledger page more closely and found, tucked between its pages, a separate slip of paper in Kestrel's hand, noting that the withdrawal had been made under protest, at the elder Ashford's insistence, against Kestrel's own written objection that the account could not safely bear it. It became apparent to the whole council, in the uncomfortable silence that followed, that the Ashford family's public grief over the Valley's lost savings had never quite mentioned that a substantial portion of what was lost had, in fact, been withdrawn by their own patriarch just before the flood, and never fully accounted for since. Marion did not press the matter further than laying the facts plainly before the council. She had learned, in her years under Garrett Voss's roof, that dignity was better served by evidence calmly presented than by accusations loudly made, and she trusted, as her father had once trusted a stuck wheel to turn again, given the right channel, that the truth, once given room to move, would find its own proper course. Otis Fairweather proposed, and the council ultimately agreed, that a formal accounting be conducted comparing Kestrel's recovered ledgers against whatever county and family records could still be gathered, under Marion's supervision as the one who had found and preserved the records, with the results to be made public before any distribution was finalized. Reuben Ashford did not stand for re-election to his council seat that autumn, and the withdrawal recorded in his father's hand became, in the months that followed, a quiet but permanent mark against a family name that had until then worn its respectability as easily and as unquestioningly as Thaddeus Bramwell's kind once had elsewhere. Proof that Marion's patience and Kestrel's careful, guilty honesty in his own final ledger entries had together done what neither could have done alone. The formal accounting took the better part of 2 months, conducted at a long table in the mill's own restored lower chamber, with Marion working alongside Otis Fairweather and a handful of the Valley's older residents who still remembered, however dimly, what their own families had once deposited with Absalom Kestrel in those years before the flood. When the final sums were reconciled, they found that the $4,300 in the strongbox, together with a smaller sum recovered from a second, less carefully hidden cache Marion discovered while repairing the wheel's secondary gearing, was enough to return to every family in the valley not merely their original deposits, but a modest measure of interest besides, exactly as Kestrel's original arrangement had promised before catastrophe overtook his good intentions. Marion could have claimed a substantial finder's portion for herself, and Otis Fairweather told her plainly that both custom and reasonable law would have supported such a claim, given that she alone had found, preserved, and painstakingly verified what would otherwise have remained lost to the valley forever. Instead, Marion asked only that the mill itself remain hers, deed and wheel and all, exactly as she had purchased it, and that a modest sum be set aside from the recovered interest to repair the town's washed-out footbridge over Cutter's Creek, which had stood unrepaired since the very flood that started this whole quiet tragedy, a bridge that farm families on the far side of the creek had done without for 18 years, fording the cold water on foot or by wagon at real risk each spring. The council agreed without dissent, and it was Marion herself, working alongside 2 local carpenters that autumn, who helped set the new bridge's timbers, and it was Marion, too, who spent the following spring restoring the mill's great waterwheel to full working order, applying every lesson her father had ever taught her about channels and currents, and the patient turning of things long thought still. When the wheel finally groaned, then turned, then settled into a steady, rushing rhythm against the current of Cutter's Creek for the first time in 18 years, Half the valley had gathered on the bank to watch. Drawn by word of the day, the wheel would run again, and the sound of it, that deep rolling creak of old wood meeting moving water, carried up the valley like something between a bell and a heartbeat. And more than one person standing on that bank that day would later say they had never expected to feel so moved by the simple sight of a mill wheel turning. It is worth returning, now, to where this story began. A 20-year-old woman with blistered feet and $15 to her name, put out by a stepfather who valued her only for what use he could make of her, and discarded her the moment that use ended. Laughed at quietly by a town that assumed her purchase of a ruined mill was the last desperate act of a girl with nothing left to lose. What Marion Teale found behind that silent water wheel was never simply lost money, though the money mattered to every family who had long since given up hope of it. What she found, and what she gave back to an entire valley, was proof of something her father had spent his whole quiet life trying to teach her: that a thing gone still is not the same as a thing gone dead. That water will always find its channel again if someone is patient enough and skilled enough to clear the way, and that the true value of a person, like the true value of an old mill wheel, is very often invisible to everyone who only glances at it from the road. Millbrook Hollow remembers her now not as the stranger who wasted her last coins on a ruin, but as the young woman who bought a broken mill for $12 and turned it into the instrument that restored, quite literally, the flow of trust between neighbors who had spent 18 years quietly grieving something they never expected to see returned. Thank you for spending this quiet hour with us and with Marion Teale. If you enjoyed her story, we would be so grateful if you would consider following or subscribing to the channel, so that the next story finds its way to you the moment it's ready. And we'd love it if you shared this one with someone who needs the reminder that patience and care can turn even the stillest thing back to life. Tell us in the comments, what is a time you found real worth in something or someone that everyone else had already written off? Until next time, stay close.